The two most well-known Inklings are C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, but often included with these other two are Owen Barfield and Charles Williams. If Charles Williams is the oddest Inkling, Owen Barfield is sometimes called the forgotten Inkling and often called the first and the last Inkling. He was Lewis's close friend before Tolkien became friends with Lewis, and he was also the last surviving Inkling, except for Christopher Tolkien, who outlived him, was of course a later Inkling. And so he's often called the first and the last Inkling. Owen Barfield was an interesting figure. He had the same kind of desire as Lewis and Tolkien and Williams to enter into the larger conversation, to take these ideas he had and share them with the world. Unfortunately, he got rather influenced by Rudolf Steiner's ideas, and because of this became less popular. In fact, he was not really well known except as a friend of Lewis, and because he was a friend of Lewis after Lewis died in the late 60s and 70s, people began to investigate his own work and to read him and see him legitimately as a scholar in his own right. His fiction and his poetry never quite picked up. People still do not go around reading his poetry and his fiction. In fact, he did not make a living as a writer, but was a solicitor in London and did that until he died. But he was interested in the same thing that all of the Inklings were interested in. He was born in the same time as Lewis, but he was born in London. He too served in World War I as Lewis and Tolkien did, but he served in Belgium as a radio operator and therefore never saw the horrors of the war the way his friends did. Lewis and Barfield met in school in 1919 and became close friends during their time at Oxford. Like Lewis, he also received a first in English, but he became an anthroposophist in 1924. His closest friend, what Lewis would call a first friend, also became a follower of Rudolf Steiner, and then later his friend's wife did as well. So the three of them were very much into Rudolf Steiner. However, Barfield's wife, Maud, never became a follower, and this was point of contention in their marriage for a long time. And also, because of these ideas, whichever really picked up traction, Owen Barfield became quite depressed that he was not as popular as his friends after his ideas were published. In 1928, he published these ideas in Poetic Diction, a book that was lauded by his friends, but again, not out in the world, and spent the rest of his life as a solicitor in London. In 1942, when Lewis's work was becoming more and more popular following his BBC talks on the radio, Lewis set up the Agape Fund, in which all of the proceeds from his sales would go into this fund for widows and orphans, and Barfield actually oversaw the distribution of these monies to people following this time period. He died in 1997. He was 99 years old, and I have had the chance to hear Bradley Burtzer talk about this and say, wouldn't it have been amazing if any of the other Inklings had lived as long as Barfield did? So Barfield was able to pick up popularity in the 80s and 90s when he himself was in his 80s and 90s. And yet Lewis died in 64 at a young age of 66 years old, and Tolkien died later in the 70s. But imagine if they would have had another 20 or 30 years, what they could have accomplished with that amount of time. Lewis and Barfield became very close friends when they were university students. About Barfield, Lewis writes in Surprised by Joy, "The second friend is the man who disagrees with you about everything. He is not so much the alter ego," which of course for Lewis, the alter ego is Arthur Greeves, who he would have called his first friend. And Barfield's alter ego was his first friend, who also became a follower of Rudolf Steiner with him. In opposition or contrast to that, the second friend, both Lewis and Barfield considered each other's second friend. They share interests, or otherwise they would not have become friends at all, but the second friend has approached them at a different angle. He's read all the right books, but has got the wrong thing out of every one. It's as if he spoke your language but mispronounced it. How can he be so nearly right and yet invariably just not right? When Lewis and Barfield became friends, Lewis had not yet converted to Christianity, and nor had Barfield, who had actually grown up in the Unitarian Church but was not a big believer in the Christian faith. He was not baptized actually as an Anglican until the 1940s. But at this point, both of them are drawn towards things like the Fantasties, like Chesterton. They're reading all the same books, the myths, the Wagner operas. They're drawn to all the same things, and yet for different reasons. Barfield is drawn to the supernatural. He is drawn to the mystical and the romantic and the otherworldly. And Lewis is not there yet. He's still an empiricist. He's still a materialist at this point. But Barfield, of course, has a great influence upon that. The great war between the two friends is over this idea of what things can be revealed. Lewis's diary, as quoted in the biography by Philip and Carol Zaleski, says, "We got into conversation on fancy and imagination. Barfield could not be made to allow any essential difference between Christina dreams, wish-fulfilling fantasies, and the material of art. He believes imagination was a legitimate tool for acquiring objective truth, while Lewis argued the imagination pointed toward truth but could not disclose it directly." So what we see in Surprised by Joy is Lewis believes these glimmers or these hints of truth we can see in the imagination. The imagination sparks something in us, right? Like the idea of autumn in Squirrel Nutkin, or the box garden produces in him a longing that leads him towards objective truth, that leads him on that road. Whereas Barfield believes the imagination actually can reveal to you directly objective truth. And it's this war that lasts almost 10 years between them as the two of them fight things out. Ultimately, Lewis decides that imagination is the organ of meaning and the intellect is the organ of truth, right? So he doesn't really come to side with Barfield, but he doesn't dismiss imagination as being a tool towards truth, whereas maybe earlier on, before he became a Christian, he would have thought more in line with that. The Great War dissolves between the two of them, not because of Barfield, who continued to love and be belligerent about ideas and really wanted to continue the Great War, but because Lewis became a Christian, this Great War seemed less meaningful to him than it had in his atheist days. Barfield wrote quite a bit about language, and these ideas influenced the Inklings and their understanding of language. We have to remember Tolkien was a philologist, so loved words and what they meant and how their sounds made you feel certain things. Lewis was drawn to the right uses of right words at the right time and not to the misuse of language, which he thought could lead to violence. Barfield saw in words an evolution of consciousness, is what he calls it, that words have lives, in a sense, that they develop as they move through time. Poetry comes from this idea of making, and this becomes a popular idea for the Inklings. Even Dorothy Sayers will pick up in the mind of the maker that our greatest or our core being as those created in the image of God is to be makers. We are homo faber. We are those who make things like God made the world. He quotes Philip Sidney, the Defense of Poetry, lifted with the vigor of his own invention in making things either better than nature bringeth forth or quite anew, forms as such were never in nature. In other words, the making or the inventing is to invent these things that are mythical or supernatural, that we're not just mere imitators of the world around us, but we are makers. We are actually, in the same way that God created this world, we are able to create things such as demigods and heroes and cyclops, that we are making those creatures by making those words. And the made up element then is that supernaturalness that we are in touch with, and that the nature of romance stories like Fantasties by George MacDonald is an exhibition of the human ability to make up things. In this essay, he's drawing a distinction that comes from Coleridge between fancy and imagination. The distinction is, so the way he defines it is that in one is the power of inventing illustrative imagery, and the other is creating form within the forms which themselves become part of nature. So what does that mean? Well, to draw the distinction more clearly, fancy is the lesser power in which you synthesize things that are already existing and bringing together ideas from what is already here. Imagination makes things that are not actually here. And there's two different ways of doing that. One of them is how you image yourself in the world, and the other is how you image new things into reality. The first is the power that every person possesses, and it's universally given. The second power of imagination is the highest one. This is the prophetic imagination that Coleridge talks about. It's the imagination that Lewis talks about in The Discarded Image. And it's the imagination that Tolkien and MacDonald talk about in their writings about fairy stories. This idea that you can create a whole nother world and a whole nother reality with this imagination. The other essay to look at that had an influence on the Inklings' ideas is From Romanticism Comes of Age. In the same way that he talks about words having developed and showing how our consciousness has evolved, reality also reveals this, the way that we see things through the words that we use, the way that we image things through our vocabulary. Therefore, it is only people living in the same period and in the same community who inhabit the same world. But people in other periods, or at the same period but in a different community, do not inhabit the same world. They have different ideas. This comes up in Lewis's Experiment in Criticism, in which he talks about it's not enough to try to read these medieval stories coming as a modernist upon these tales. You have to put on the armor of the knight and walk around in his armor to fully understand the story itself. You have to put yourself into that other community and into that other world, and not assume that that world has to be judged by your community and your time. It's what Alan Jacobs talks about in Breaking Bread with the Dead as being guests at another table, to go back in time, to enter imaginatively that community. One example that Barfield gives is in reading Homer. If we try to read the Greek words and then translate them, so many things will get lost in translation because they imaged reality differently than we do. In English, we would say something like, that man has a beard, or he grows a beard, whereas in Greek, they would have written the word foamed at the face, that he was foaming. The very language shows a different communal way of understanding the appearance of beards. Barfield was probably most influential on the Inklings with his feedback for what these words are and what they mean and the connotations that they have. His romantic way of understanding the imagination, of understanding images. One can imagine him in that setting with those men smoking their pipes, having their drinks, and all discussing these things, discussing these texts, and reading one another's works aloud to one another. Barfield was writing children's stories in the same way that Tolkien was and Lewis was. They were very much aligned in the things that they wanted to do, and yet, of course, Lewis and Tolkien were much more successful in their output than Barfield was. But even if they were more successful or popular with their output, we shouldn't underestimate the influence that the man Barfield himself had on that group as their ideas were coming to fruition, as they were trying to understand imagination and their roles as makers and poets of these fantastical worlds that they introduced all of us to.